If you can have a detailed schedule of who's up for repairs, who's up for maintenance, who's up for replacement, that schedule at the back of the lease is certainly the biggest trend. Well, you live and die by that lease, Trudy.
Yeah.
It is the most fundamental document that's going to shape that investment.
Yes.
It can be the best motel location, but if the lease and the relationship between the landlord and the tenant, if that's not there and it's not balanced, it won't be a good investment.
It's a relationship that exists. It's not just transactional. So having somebody that is knowledgeable, that you can know and then you can trust along the way, you get the right relationship.
Yeah.
This could be for the entirety of your career in the space. Specifically in regards to leases, what would be the 3 main points that you would deliver for people that are thinking about getting into this game? Welcome to RB Radio. I'm Frank.
And I'm Trudy. Join us as we explore the very exciting world of the accommodation industry.
We're going to walk you through the ever-evolving landscape of hotels, motels, caravan parks and management rights, but more importantly, the communities and the stories that underpin them all.
From market trends and expert predictions to the personal success stories and many lessons learned, we're going to cover it all.
Join us and let's embark on this journey through the weird and wonderful world of the accommodation industry together. Welcome back to RB Radio, the podcast for resort brokers. And Trudy Crooks, welcome back. Managing Director of Resort Brokers. You've been off conquering the world.
I have been. I've been all over the country in the last couple of weeks. It's busy out there.
It's good to have you back. It's busy out there.
Yes,
good to hear.
It is.
Excellent, excellent. Well, welcome back. Thank you very much. We've got a very special guest with us today. We've got Trent Pevy from Pevy Lawyers. Now, Trent's a bit of a special case with resort brokers. He's been working with us for a long time across the whole gamut of our businesses: hotels, motels, management rights, parks, your house, you know, everything from the kitchen sink. I think he'd probably be a solicitor for as well. And if you're anything like me, I like to have my solicitors on speed dial, right? So Trent is one of those guys that will do a little bit of everything nationwide. Trent Pevy, thank you very much for joining us on RB Radio.
Thanks, Frank. Appreciate it.
Mate, very, very happy to have you here. Now, you do everything in the accommodation space. Resorts, hotels, motels, parks, management rights. But today I know, Trudy, you really want to get down into the nitty-gritty of the hotels and motels and park space, and specifically about some specific leasing.
Yeah, just because we're seeing so much activity in the market, Frank.
Yeah.
You know, leasing as a model has been so successful because when it was first created 40 years ago this year, coincidentally, in line with our birthday, happy birthday, Resort Brokers, the big 4-0.
Special episode coming up soon.
There is indeed. But when it was first brought in to Australia, because it started in New Zealand, when the first lease was set up, and then it just took off so successfully. And we reckon 80% of all motels and half of parks across the country. So motels is where it first was implemented, and then the same underlying factors and methods, without getting too technical around formulas, because that's a bit dull. But the same formulas underpin both of them. But the model was so good because effectively the value of these assets are getting so significant because, you know, when they were first built, particularly parks, but, you know, they were built on the side of these little regional towns, and then the towns have grown around them. So they're often prime locations, prime real estate, you know, good number of keys. They're becoming pretty valuable. And so the idea that the person who really appeals to being their own boss, having free living, you know, living on site, is maybe not someone who's in the position to be able to buy the whole thing, or they actually want to buy a more positive cash flow business. I think that's the great thing about leases. You know, you buy them at such good returns.
Giving some options for the people that want to get involved rather than having to stump up just a huge amount of cash to get it on a freehold basis.
And they're great investments, but we're not going to talk about that today.
Okay.
So we've seen the return in a housing crisis to leases being back after, obviously, I don't want to say the C word, but you know, the leasing code of conduct and all that. We're actually lessees were very protected. You know, we've really seen that trend. So, but we're not here to talk.
No,
just
it's
that.
Not
We're here to talk
today.
No, it's not.
I was hoping I was going to get a word in, actually.
No, absolutely
Sorry,
not. In this
two
thing,
agents.
you're just window dressing today, Trent. Thank you very much.
But Trent, we have been working with you and your fabulous team for 15 years now. Pevy Lawyers have been going for 16 years, am I right?
That's right. That's right. Time flies when you're having fun,
It
Trudy.
certainly does, and I reckon we'll settle 225 deals this year,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that you'll be on many of those. And look, we always recommend you, because we always say, all joking aside, that no matter how experienced you are, every business is different, every lease is different, and so you need to have specialists. You know, and
We've said that more than a couple of times, is
wow, I
keeping your
think it's
specialists
probably
close and your enemies closer, or something like that.
do you know what? I think it's the most important thing, really.
Well, I
I'd
mean,
agree.
I've been on over 3,000 accommodation industry
Wow.
transactions before. I still learn on every one.
Yeah,
Same
wow.
thing for all our lawyers. So when people are out there saying they're an expert in the field, you've got to be conscious that you don't know what you don't know.
No, of course.
And especially when it comes to an area like leasing, we talk about this being around for 40 years.
Yeah.
And that's almost as old as you and I, Trudy. Probably not you,
Definitely
Frank.
someone
But-
that you know.
But the reality is that's still not a long time. It's not a long time in the context of the law. Lease is a landlord and tenant relationship. It's been around since the caste system way back in the 1200s of England. So it's still a dynamic area. It's still an area where things aren't always perfect, and that allows us the opportunity to, I guess, sculpt things, make things better, learn from experiences, learn from major events, small events, a particular landlord, what a tenant has. So all these things go into the mix where that's what makes it a really great opportunity today, because it's not set in its ways.
No.
There are still opportunities there which you might not get in a traditional leasing sense.
It's not cookie cutter. Every deal is a little bit different.
Completely
and
bespoke.
That's why you need somebody that's a specialist there to be able to go with the ebb and flow of how these things. It's a moving target.
It's a moving target, but the lease is set. Unless
Right.
you're setting up a new lease, and often when new lease goes to market,
Yes.
there's a draft lease in place. And I think newcomers, or anytime someone wants to amend the lease, we'd be very cautious of agreeing a deal with the lessee, because they can't control the landlord. Do you see that?
Well, you live and die by that lease, Trudy.
Yeah.
It is the most fundamental document that's going to shape that investment.
Yes.
It can be the best motel location, it can have the most diverse clientele, but if the lease and the relationship between the landlord and the tenant, which is governed by that lease, if that's not there and it's not balanced, it doesn't have the right parameters set out, it won't be a good investment. So our job is, when people are making offers to proceed with one of these investments, they're doing so on assumptions, and our main role is to convert those assumptions into facts.
Yeah.
I'm a motelier myself. I don't mind admitting that.
That's
both
good. You got boots on the ground.
both freehold and leasehold across a
Yes.
number of state jurisdictions.
Yes.
So it's something that excites me into going into those
Yes.
areas. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to be nationwide, like resort brokers, and there's only a handful out of us
There
that
is.
do.
Yeah.
What makes a good motel in Margaret River, WA, is often what's going to make a good motel in Tasmania, or a
Totally.
park in
Totally.
Ulladulla, or wherever it might be. Understanding those commercial drivers is what we hope sets us apart and allows us to impart our experience to make sure that people are taking advantage where they can take advantage
Yes.
of these things, but also making sure that they can avoid potentially an investment that might not be what they think it is. At the end of the day, and I think this is what Resort Brokers does really well, and why we're always happy to talk of our association. Not that there's kickbacks, as much as I'd like them from
No.
you guys.
Yeah. No kickbacks.
We
No
are staunchly
kickbacks.
independent.
I'm still looking for the ones from you guys, actually. I think I dropped them on the way.
But at the end of the day, I think we've got similar goals, which is you want informed people investing in
Totally.
this industry. When we act for someone when they purchase one of these investments for the first time, we want to be there throughout the whole journey. We want to be there when they go to sell.
So do we. We want to be on their way in and the way out.
And I reckon we've got
Exactly.
plenty of years left, Trudy. They
we do.
definitely
We've got
don't let
another
me out
40
like
for
you,
sure.
but we're certainly there for the long haul.
But that's kind of a unique thing about the accommodation space and the associates that we use, and the lawyers especially, is it's a relationship that exists. It's not just transactional. It's a relationship that can happen and grow a long time. So having somebody that is knowledgeable, that you can know and that you can trust along the way, you get the right relationship. This could be for the entirety of your career in the space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But also you get the wrong advice. Like sometimes we'll see someone who might have been a first-time buyer and they just didn't understand what
Well,
the
they just
lease
don't
said.
understand the background of it, you know,
Yeah.
where the importance of having a specialist. Because I might have a solicitor that's been the family lawyer forever.
All the time.
But we've said it before and we'll say it again, you don't use a GP to do heart surgery, right? You make sure that you use specialists along the way.
on.
And that relationship that you can set up from the start, you could be with you through through the end of your career, Trent, which is 40 or 50 years from now.
At least,
you know?
Exactly.
at least. My wife would say otherwise. But the thing is that specialising, like resort brokers are specialise in this space, we have had to as well.
Yeah.
It isn't GP land.
No.
It is an
really
area.
isn't.
No, it is an area that requires specialists, requires experience. If you bring general leasing principles into a setting like a motel, they won't work.
No.
And the main difference, Trudy, though, is that we cannot take that business away. If I'm going and leasing, if I've got a florist shop and I'm putting it into a Westfield or something like that, I know that if my lease ends, I can move my florist shop down the road. There might be some impacts to the goodwill, my customer base, all those sorts of things, but you cannot move a motel somewhere else. A motel business is rigid, it's flex. So yes, we talk about it being a motel lease, but I wish we had a different word for it.
I know what you mean.
Because it isn't just a lease landlord-tenant relationship. It's much more than that.
And I think that's, if we drill into that a little bit more, right? And I always think the shop analogy is good.
Yes.
If you think I'm going to start a shop business, or it's 6 months, often you'll get a contribution from the landlord for the fit out, and there might be a bond there, but it's such a short tenure, whereas hotel and motel and park leases are traditionally 30 years, 10 years, and 4 5-year options.
Because it takes time to build these
It
businesses
takes 3 years
and to
build
settle
them,
in.
but also because of the goodwill factor, actually.
Yeah.
It's because, unlike a shed or a shop, where people will move next door if the rent's cheaper, people go to that property because they like the person when they check in knows what they've been doing, knows their name, knows what room they like. Particularly when you're on the road a lot like I am.
Yeah.
That's got real value. We're creatures of habit. And I think that's where, if you don't have a specialist lawyer, they don't understand, like you say, that traditional leasing stuff, which sometimes comes up. And it
is
doesn't
infiltrating
apply.
it more and more in some
So tell us about
jurisdictions.
that.
Yeah. So you talked about the motel lease being 30 years long, sometimes even longer than that, which, as you know, that tenure helps create an environment where a tenant wants to invest in their business.
Exactly.
Now, we go back to the florist in Westfield. I can invest in that business, but I can also move it around everywhere. But you can't do that with a motel. No. So what makes a motel lease unique is that we want to set up a relationship between a landlord and tenant where the tenant is left alone to run their business, do it properly, make a return, not have their return impacted by external factors outside of them. As long as they pay the rent and as long as the landlord provides a structurally sound building in order to do that, then it's up to the tenant whether they're going to succeed or not. So we do a lot in managed rights, as do you. We used to talk about managed rights was a bit lower risk because you would be sharing the risk with all the lot owners who own the units in the building. So if it's empty for the night, then okay, the lot owner's going to be taking some of that fall. As the operator, you would as well. In a motel, it's 100% on you.
The other thing is with management rights is you get the first clip of the ticket. So whether you get $100 or $150 a night, you're getting a percentage of that, but all the costs, which obviously in an environment that we're in now, the costs are the most significant thing for people, making sure that the bottom line doesn't outrace the top line. You're still getting the first clip and the costs are passed on. So I agree with you. There's more upside, I always reckon, in
but there's
leasing.
that separation between church and state there under the leasing model.
Well, it's your business.
It's
so
your
you
business.
get all the upside.
Yep.
If all of a sudden it's in a prime spot and there's a big carnival and you're full, you get the benefit of that. Unless you're in Victoria. So maybe we should drill a little bit and talk about what are you seeing, some of the new things popping up.
Yes.
Or what are some of the questions or points that get raised to you often by someone who might not know.
I'm not the first guy to do this, as you know. They're the generation before us,
Yeah, our forefathers.
including the founder of Resort Brokers, who pioneered that leasing model. When we came into it, there was set rules. This is what we wanted to do. We wanted to have a lease that was broken up over 5-year options. Main motivation for that is that a lot of jurisdictions don't allow a tenant to be off the hook once they sell their business. So by breaking it up into 5-year options, when someone goes to sell, they're only on the hook potentially in some jurisdictions up until the end of that option. So if you've got a straight 30-year term and you sell the business with 27 years to go, you don't want to be looking over your shoulder for 27 years.
No.
Some jurisdictions have brought in now rules to change that, where you have to be released in certain circumstances. But
Some states.
Some states. Commercial leasing and retail leasing are often two different things. Retail leasing, a lot of consumer protection.
Yeah, okay.
In a motel setting, most jurisdictions, Victoria being the exception, where some retail influences do come in. But otherwise, it's really down to what's in your contract itself.
Yes.
Again, it's not an area that's actually heavily influenced by the law. So far as people in Parliament making rules to say, hey, we're protecting tenants.
Itself.
We look at how many changes there are in residential tenancies. Every year that's a topic.
New one. Yep.
Exactly. In motel settings, they can be quite a stable environment because it falls back on the contract itself. So when we say you live and die by your lease, it's the truth. It's the truth. So if I see a lease that's got a 30-year straight term, straight away I'm thinking, okay, when our client goes to sell, how are they going to get off the hook here? And maybe that's something, what other bargaining chips are we going to have to be able to potentially write that? You talk about a tenure that long, that's a long time to have a set rent. Whether that rent is going to be linked to the consumer price index movement, which is the most common way of doing things, whether there's going to be the odd market reviews in there. Market reviews used to be very much a no-no when it came to motel leasing, mainly because the goodwill factor, the value that a tenant is delivering. If they're shooting the lights out and this place is full every night, it looks fantastic. It's number one on all the review sites.
Because they've gone in there, they give great service. They bake cookies, they leave it in rooms. All those.
They're treating a small business like a small business should be treated.
They would be traditionally punished in a market review situation because a landlord would say, well, hang on, you're making all this money.
So well.
Yeah.
And I think that concept of being able to have your fair go, and if you do a good job, you shouldn't be punished by that. So market reviews, again, some jurisdictions.
Victoria's different.
Yeah,
Victoria's have
where it
reviews.
can go up or down. Yeah. And we saw, especially coming out of COVID, that was an area which there was a lot of national relief for tenants, and some of that got actually washed up in motel land and parkland as well. But coming out of that, I think there's been a little bit of a healthy debate about having some market reviews at longer intervals. Obviously, we don't want them every year.
So tell me about that, because you can tell we didn't plan this.
Yes.
Because we've got to, tell me your opinion on that.
I'm not sitting there advocating that a market review is absolutely the way to go, but if it's collared appropriately so that there is still some certainty for a performing tenant, that's fine. Otherwise, a tenant, you can't sell your business. When we do due diligence on a motel, if we're acting for a tenant, we're also looking at everything from a landlord perspective as well.
Well, a good lease is a fair lease, right? Because it can
balanced
stand
lease,
the test
exactly
of
right.
time.
That's right, because it's not only two parties that are going to be involved in this. You have to think about, what is it that your dad says, that the money's in the buying, not in the selling.
Yeah, you do.
So you have to be considering your exit strategy when you're on the way in.
It can be the best. It can be the best motel for you, but if it's not going to appeal to the market when you go to sell, what's the point? So
it's got to be priced in. Yeah. To be fair, as long as it's priced for things that people are aware going in, there's a buy for everything.
You guys typically find them too.
For you.
But your operation of the business, your resale prospects, those things all go into the mix. I go back to rite of passage for most lawyers coming up. You spend a bit of time in England, and I
think that's Australian.
I was fortunate, fortunate or unfortunate enough to be working in the world's largest law firm. The biggest takeaway that I had from there is that, guys, we don't have a lease if we're acting for a landlord, and a lease if we're acting for a tenant. We have something balanced. Because as lawyers, there's too much of that. Let's go and put down this perfect document for a landlord, and then all you do is waste time negotiating back to the middle. Whereas if you produce something balanced at the start, you save time, you save cost.
It becomes about the transaction
Exactly.
and about the business.
You don't get people feeling like they're losing out.
Yeah.
The moment you start negotiating changes, so if we see a lease and we've got to make 20 changes to that lease, straight away the other side's going, well, we can't give them all 20.
But I do think this is just to clarify that, right? Is that's only if you're in the position where you're taking the first lease, because most leases that are transacting, you've got an existing lease, right? Where there are existing landlords aren't. Because of what you say, you're absolutely right.
Yes.
Normally someone wants to change something to make it more commercially beneficial to that side, whereas the other side, if they're not selling, what's the benefit to give up something, right? So unless you've got a reason or you've got both parties to agree, people shouldn't go into buying a lease thinking they can change the lease. I just don't think they should. I think that's bad practice.
I understand that, but at the same time, Trudy, if we can see that there's certain things that we know a freeholder, so the person who owns the buildings and is relying on that rent, and we can see things in that lease just because it wasn't drafted very well that we know that they're going to want from the tenant to enable them to sell in the future. It's just understanding those bargaining positions. It might sit there for 5 or 6 years, but the reality is people don't often give things away under legal demand for nothing.
No, it's a commercial investment for
They'll
people,
do it if they absolutely have to, but otherwise, horse trading is still a factor out there. But
it certainly is when you're buying more years too.
Yes.
Right, which we could do a whole podcast on.
You're not
going
and by that you mean the extension of the leases,
extension of the lease,
and so to perpetuate your business because you love it and you're in
just
there
the
doing it forever,
No.
and then it's how it perpetuates rather than
no. The values, yes, but the value sits in the tenure.
Yes.
Right, as well as the profit. Right,
Yes.
they're your two bigger underlying factors of where the yield
and one
sits.
begets the other a little bit.
Yeah, well, the thing is, the shorter the lease,
Yeah.
obviously, the less you have to resell. And if you think the average lessee sits in there for 5 to 7 years, you don't think about it when you go in, but you go in at 15 years, can I tell you, 8 years, that person's got nothing to sell.
Yeah.
You're only 2 lessees away from nothing. So when you go back to the landlord to buy more years, that's when I think you can also really bring a lot of bargaining on the way through.
Trent, just on that, what in your experience, what is the average tenure in a lease, for an operator?
They start to, what we see is they start to devalue.
Yes.
Under 20 years. It's interesting.
Okay. Yeah,
20 to 10
Do you
is
see
really
the same?
different.
Yeah.
But 20 to 30 doesn't add a whole lot of value, right?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and that's why it came back to 30 years or 25 years as it used to be. I think it'll just keep climbing
So do
higher.
I.
Yeah.
Having that value back. Banks were part of the driver of that, wanting to make sure that they could structure loans out over as long as period as possible, that we weren't hitting that magic sort of 15-year mark. But I think what you said before, Trudy, is spot on in terms of it's what you're leaving for the next guy when you go to sell. So if your strategy is I want to get in there, I know I can do a better job than perhaps who's there right now.
Grow the business.
Grow the business, or whether it's your skill set, whether it's your passion, whether it's your energy, those things. You can use those and go, right, this is going to be how long my game plan is. I want to be in here. If I sell by this time, I don't have to worry about approaching a landlord for more years. A landlord's not obliged to give more years. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a contract. It needs 2 parties to agree to make changes. I can't unilaterally change a lease on you, Trudy, and likewise you can't do on me. But as I was coming back to, there's always different things though, which we might need from each other. I mean, I think when we start looking at a lease in a due diligence phase, especially from a tenant's perspective, to me, there's 3 types of landlords that you've got out there. You've got the landlord that may have been sold into this particular venture, or this investment, I should say. You're going to get paid the rent. You don't have to lift a finger. You're not going to do anything. And those guys can be quite challenging because if there's something goes wrong with a motel,
they're not that fast, maybe.
Yeah, they're slow to react to the roof caving in, or if there's a water leak, water penetration problem, whatever it might be. That landlord can be quite challenging to work with, but they can also be great if things are going well and you just left to your own devices as a tenant.
Yep.
It cuts both ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second type of landlord is the one where, and they're probably our favourite, the ones that are in there and they're like, we appreciate that this is a team in a way.
Yeah.
A strong tenant means a strong freehold value.
Which is so true.
We want to support that tenant when they need it. We want to be quick if there's something. Exactly right.
I don't know if enough landlords think of it that, because I do think that the the first thing sophisticated buyers, and now the price is getting so big on these, that sophisticated as more commercial money comes in, first thing they ask you is what's the tenant
relationship
like? Because the security of the lease, the guarantees that sit behind it, and the strength of the tenant is one of their biggest factors around value.
Is that question asked both ways? Is like, what's the relationship with your landlord like?
Yeah,
For the people
that's
that
a
are...
question, but because
it is,
there's a legal document, it's not... Again, they want to know.
A lease can, no legal document, not even a lease, no legal document can legislate for everything.
And legislate a relationship
and
as well.
attitudes, and also changes in the environment. Change the environment. Like no lease had COVID clauses in it before COVID, for example. No leases had provisions in there that deal with crazy necessarily. They deal with the main populace. Who
But they're
might be
a pretty solid market.
But I would say that that type of landlord we're just talking about. Those guys exist out there. Those landlords exist out there, and they are gold when you see them. And I would say in the main, most are like that. The third type of landlord that you get out there, though, coming back to what I was saying, is the one that's already an experienced motelier or accommodation provider who go, you know what, I can do a better job than the tenant.
So engaged, disengaged, overzealous.
Yeah, overzealous or predatory, even you would say. And those,
this is a family show.
And there can be an attitude where I want to breach first every time, which might sound like a lawyer's dream, but it's not. We do see that. We do see that. Yeah, it's. I know that might come as a surprise because
I've got to be honest, I just genuinely don't hear of it.
Those people aren't typically approaching you to say, hey, can you sell my business? Because they're sitting there going, well, if this tenant doesn't shape up, I'm going to keep creating more pressure and more pressure and more pressure. And that's when you come back to the sanctity of the lease. If you can have a good lease in place that protects you from those circumstances, you don't have to be looking over your shoulder as much. First rights of refusal is one of the most common things that you see in these leases. So if I'm a tenant and I want to sell my business, I have to first offer it to the landlord. And it's based on a market value.
Is this across jurisdictions
as well? Everywhere.
In the lease.
It's written in the lease.
No. So it's not done.
If it's written in the lease.
Yeah, that's all that it is. It's not about the jurisdiction.
So it's not about legislation. It's about how the lease is constructed.
Totally.
I'd like to be able to say South Australian landlords, for example, never exercise their first rights of refusal, but occasionally they do, as Kelly would know, for example. But the thing is that these first right of refusal. People go into these investments knowing that, okay, if that tenant goes to sell, then maybe there is the opportunity for me to convert into a freehold going concern.
And we've done a lot of that at the moment.
Reshape the lease, split off a lease. There's all these different things. And that's
where reset the rent, all these kind of things,
And so to me, it's very rare that a motel lease will run from 30 years down to zero. Very rare. There's normally a renegotiation exercise at some stage, or someone's looking to sell. But we don't see options, and what I mean by that is an option to buy. We don't see someone being able to force the other person to sell to them. So it's the timing thing. You don't control the timing. So if I'm the landlord and I'm sitting there going, I'd love to get my hands on that leasehold, I can't make the tenant do that, and vice versa.
And you can offer them a lot of money, obviously.
The reality is a lot of tenants might not be able to buy out a landlord either, because the value of those two things is quite different. Other things in a motel lease that is unique to that particular setting is things like bonds and bank guarantees that you would see.
Explain that, because they weren't traditionally there, right? It was because, again, you go back to the beginning.
Can't move the motel.
The profile of the purchaser, it was often everything they had. They sold their house, they quit their jobs, they took a redundancy, and they bought themselves a home and a business. And that's why it was so successful. So really you had, everyone spends it to the top of their budget. So you had people who were really invested. This is everything they had.
All the way in.
And they had personal guarantees often. But now you're seeing it,
they can't move the motel anywhere else either. So the motel itself is a security. The business itself is the security for a landlord.
And it can't be moved. That's an important point that you made right from the beginning.
If the tenant doesn't pay the rent, then generally speaking, you're not breaching them on day one anyway, because things can happen, ups and downs, seasonal impacts in certain areas. But the thing is, if they're breaching that lease, you always have that security of the motel there. As a landlord, that you can step back in and arrange for someone to resell it.
Exactly.
Worst thing that can happen is you get your lease back, and it can be resold.
And it can be a headache, of course.
No, but the thing is, there's great managers. There's huge demand for them.
Problems that can be solved.
I mean,
problems that can be solved that you can't solve in a shopping centre setting, where you go, well, I can't just go in and take all the flowers out of the florist, and there's no market for that. So,
That's an interesting point.
Bank guarantees and bonds, whether it's 3 months, whether it's you even see some crazy things where they're asking for 6 months. Well, if the rent's $300,000, that's $150,000.
So why would a landlord ask that? What would their argument be?
We're seeing more and more that there are requests for these. Part of it is because of the ignorance of some of the advisors out there, the people who aren't as experienced,
just
and they
looking
go,
at it
well,
from
hang on,
a
I'm
purely
looking at a
commercial
lease.
standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. I'm looking at a lease, and there's no bank guarantee here. There's no bond here. That's crazy. There should be.
So would motels be the only? Because again, this is funny. All we do is specialise in accommodation. In other industries, normal to have a bond.
Absolutely, and part of that is liquidity. That ease of being able to access funds quickly to make up the arrears of a tenant, whether it's rent, whether it's a land tax bill, whatever it might be. But I think we are starting to see a trend now where landlords are, especially when we talk about those 3 types of landlords, the first one in particular, they don't want to go through that process of having to take it off. Exactly. Well, the access to justice and the time that it takes, it's much easier to grab a bond. So whilst I don't want to be sitting here advocating it for it, because I know the motels I own, there's no bonds on any of those.
And I don't know if there needs to be. To be fair, I think it's capital tied up. It shouldn't be there.
But I wouldn't let it stop me. I wouldn't let it stop me, though, from a good opportunity. That's the thing. And whereas in the past,
I'm with you.
Some would say that. It's an extra little bit of cash flow you might have to manage, but so be it.
I agree. If everything else is perfect and it's the one you want, I agree. There's been a move in that. If you can afford it, really, 6 months rent, buy it.
Trent, we're running out of time here, as we always do. So just to round us out, what are the 3 main points that you would give and deliver to our listeners, specifically in regards to leases? What would be the 3 main points that you would deliver for people that are trying to or thinking about getting into this game?
Detail in the lease.
Yep.
So important. If you can have a detailed schedule of who's up for repairs, who's up for maintenance, who's up for replacement, that schedule at the back of the lease is certainly the biggest trend. I mean, it's the more detailed, the less scope for dispute. If you've got wishy-washy, must keep things in first-class order and repair, reasonable, all those sorts of wishy-washy words. If you can have a schedule at the back, which, and we were one of the architects of this, of having 4 columns that says, hey, this is the landlord's responsibility to who owns it, who replaces it, who maintains it, who's up for repair.
And that's a change in the last decade, because it used to be ambiguous was good. The whole industry thinks oppositely.
Exactly. I think that's...
Detail of the lease is number one.
Detail of the leases is number one. And if I can just finish off that part, like AAA rating, for example, and how things move there. It used to be that these guys would step up, the independent body,
people,
and they'd go and star rate it. Now, if you can get a star rating in once every 5 years, you're doing well. But the self-rating thing is definitely the other trend. So moving into that, off the back of that repairs and maintenance, if you've got a repairs, maintenance and replacement schedule at the back of your lease, it makes it easier to agree to the landlord where that star rating or where that self-rating should fall. Damage and destruction. And unfortunately, coming off the back of big weather events, I think back to the floods that came through Mundubba and Bundaberg. There was unfortunately a real gap in some leases where they said that if the motel was damaged, the landlord could just simply say, hey, we're going to call it a day. The lease will get torn up. And even if the motel was salvageable, even if the insurance proceeds,
were enough to cover it.
Back then it was a bit easier to get flood cover, a bit harder now. I'm always looking out for the next shower because I know one of my motels we can't get flood cover. The thing is that the landlord could take the opportunity of that and go, beauty, I've now got a redevelopment site. Even though that tenant has been paying the premiums on the landlord's insurance to cover the rebuild.
Because the lease just didn't cover
make sure
for
that
it.
you've got damage and
Make
destruction.
sure damage and destruction, there's an awareness. You might not be able to change it, but there are insurance products out there now which can help protect the goodwill component of what a tenant is paying. So I think that damage and destruction part is a real focus point. And it never was a focus point.
No, it wasn't.
But now, and also, what is damage? Is it fire in one room, or is it half the motel?
So be a bit specific. That comes back to the first point of the detail of the lease, damage and destruction. And to wind us up, what would be your third
Oh, I'm
piece.
interested.
If
it's
you
like,
can
what's
come
it
down
going
to
to
the last
be?
one,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
setting the
I
pregnant
wasn't
pause.
expecting that as the second, so I'm trying me. Yeah.
No, third point I think I would say, and it might seem simple here, is actually having a good understanding as to what you actually have to pay each month. You know,
Yeah.
rent and outgoings. Now, what is an outgoing? I mean, it might sound crazy, but is it every single land holding cost that that landlord has? You know, what can they pass on there? I still bring it back to this. We want to try and see a motel lease that allows the tenant to go and do their business.
successful, reinvest,
I would rather have a situation where the tenant is up for more repairs and maintenance rather than less. I'd rather have the situation where the tenant knows they've just got to cover as much of the land holding costs as possible without interference, without fluctuation. You want something that's stable. You want to know.
read the lease before we give anyone pricing advice.
Well, and if there's anything that you don't like in there, you often throw it to us to say, hey, what's your opinion on this, Trent? And we're very happy to do that, because at the end of the day, we're all in it. We're all in it together.
We're all in it together.
As either as the consultants in the industry or an investor as well. You know, you want to make sure that it's strong and healthy. At the end of the day, these values and what they transact for, it's testament to that. It's what happens in the next 40 years.
Yeah, exactly.
That we want to make sure we can continue.
We're glad
Trent,
to have you with us.
We're
for the
probably going to
next
have to
40.
come back to this, because there's
do.
probably about 10,000 questions we
so
didn't
many
actually
things,
get to.
yeah.
Right, so we'll schedule another time. Trent Pevy from Pevy Lawyers, thank you very much for coming on
Thank you,
board
Frank.
to RB Radio and talking to us about specifically the leases and the motels, hotels and park
parks.
side of things. Next time we've got to get your experience in on the management right side as well. But Trent, thank you very much for
You're a
joining us.
Always
legend,
happy.
Trent. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Cheers.
Appreciate it.
Thank you
you.
very much. Thank you for joining us at RB Radio.
If you enjoyed the insights from this episode, we'd love your support with a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Stay connected with us on all social media platforms at Resort Brokers. We're excited to continue this journey with you and see you in the next episode.
See you then.